There is a moment, a very specific moment, in almost every relationship with a dismissive, avoidant person, where you either become the one they marry or you become the one they eventually let go of, quietly, months or years later, with no clear explanation. And here's the unsettling part. That moment isn't determined by how much they love you. It's determined by something else entirely, something almost nobody is told about, something that has nothing to do with romance and everything to do with a decision this person's brain makes about you long before they ever consciously decide anything. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what that decision is, exactly when it gets made, and exactly what puts you on the side of the line that leads to commitment, instead of the side that leads to 6 more months of confusion. Let me tell you about 2 women. I'll call them Claire and Maya. Both, at the same time, several years apart, dated the same man. I'll call him Ryan. Ryan is a textbook dismissive avoidant, successful, charming, allergic to labels. With Claire, the relationship lasted 11 months. 11 months of, let's just see where things go. 11 months of Claire slowly shrinking herself, texting less so she wouldn't seem needy, cancelling plans with friends to be available whenever he had time, quietly hoping that if she just gave it enough space, enough patience, enough time, he'd eventually choose her. He never did. He ended it with almost no explanation, and 2 months later he was engaged to someone else. That someone else was Maya. And here's what's strange. Maya wasn't more beautiful than Claire. She wasn't more patient, or more accommodating, or more understanding of his attachment style. If anything, she was less accommodating. 3 months in, she had one direct, calm conversation with him about where things were headed. She didn't chase him afterward. She didn't shrink. She kept her own life exactly as full as it had been before he showed up in it. 8 months later, he proposed. Same man, 2 completely different outcomes. And the difference wasn't luck, and it wasn't chemistry. It was one specific thing Maya did that Claire never did, something we're going to unpack piece by piece over the next several minutes, because once you see it, you'll understand exactly why some people wait years for a commitment that never comes, while others, with the exact same type of partner, get there in under a year. Let's start with the myth, because almost everyone gets this part wrong. The myth is that dismissive avoidants don't commit because they don't feel enough, that they're emotionally hollow or incapable of love, or just not that invested. If that were true, this would be a very short video. Break up, move on, find someone capable of love. Simple. But that's not what the research shows, and it's definitely not what shows up over and over again when you actually study these relationships closely. Dismissive avoidants fall in love deeply, sometimes obsessively, sometimes more intensely than people realize, because that intensity gets hidden behind a wall of composure. The problem was never the depth of feeling. The problem is what happens to that feeling once it starts asking for something in return. Here's the mechanism, and I want you to really lock this in, because everything else in this video builds on top of it. But a dismissive avoidant person's brain runs on a single unconscious question every time a relationship starts to deepen. That question is not, do I love this person? It's, does loving this person cost me myself? Read that again in your head. Does loving this person cost me myself? That question was installed early, usually in childhood, usually by an environment where love and control got tangled together. Maybe a parent who only showed affection when the child performed, when they achieved something, when they behaved a certain way. Maybe a household where emotional needs were met with intrusion instead of warmth, where privacy wasn't respected, where being close to someone meant being managed by them. Whatever the specific origin, the lesson that got burned in was the same. Closeness equals a loss of self. Commitment equals disappearing into someone else's expectations. Picture a child who only ever got a hug after bringing home the right report card, or a child whose diary got read, whose door didn't have a lock, whose no was never really respected once a parent decided something was for their own good. That child learns, early and thoroughly, that being loved and being controlled are the same experience wearing 2 different masks. So when that child grows up and someone says, I love you, let's build a future together, the adult brain doesn't hear romance. Some old buried part of it hears the click of a door being locked from the outside. That's not a flaw in character, that's a trained response. And trained responses can be retrained, but only under the right conditions, which is exactly what we're going to map out. So here's the first thing you need to understand about the timeline. Every attachment style runs on a different internal clock before they're ready to commit, and dismissive avoidants run on the longest one, not because they need more time to fall in love, but because they need more time to prove to themselves, over and over, that loving you isn't going to cost them their identity. A securely attached person typically needs somewhere around 2 to 4 months. They're simply gathering information. Is this a good fit? Is this person kind, consistent, aligned with my life? Straightforward vetting, nothing dramatic. A fearful avoidant, someone caught between wanting closeness and fearing it at the same time, usually needs closer to 3 to 5 months because they're running two competing systems simultaneously, one that craves you and one that's terrified of you. And those two systems have to reach some kind of temporary truce before commitment feels possible. An anxious, preoccupied person can be ready shockingly fast, sometimes within 2 weeks, because their nervous system treats connection itself as the safety signal. The moment it feels good, the alarm quiets down, and they'll often want to lock that feeling in immediately before it can slip away. And then there's the dismissive avoidant. 4.5 months on the fast end, 7 months more typically, and in plenty of cases I've seen personally, over a year, sometimes closer to 2, without ever reaching a formal spoken commitment. Now here's the open loop I want to plant because we're going to come back to this in a few minutes and it changes everything you think you understand about that long timeline. It is not actually about time at all. Time is just the surface symptom. There is one specific behavior, one specific thing the other person does that can either shrink that 7-month timeline down to something reasonable or stretch it out indefinitely, sometimes forever. Keep that in the back of your mind. What is the one behavior that actually moves the needle? We'll get there. For now, let's talk about why so many people get stuck in the confusing middle of this timeline, because this is where most relationships with dismissive avoidance quietly fall apart, long before anyone official ever calls it off. This middle zone has a name, even if most people have never heard it used correctly. It's often called a situationship, and it's not an accident. It's not a phase two people are just passing through on the way to something real. For a dismissive avoidant, the situationship is often the entire destination, comfortable, low risk, emotionally satisfying enough to keep, structured enough to avoid the two things they fear most, abandonment and engulfment, at the exact same time. Think about how clever that arrangement actually is. From a purely self-protective standpoint, in a situationship, there's enough closeness to feel connected, enough intimacy to feel like a real relationship day to day, but no formal label, no defined future, no moment where they have to say out loud, "This is who I'm choosing, this is who I'm building a life with." That sentence, more than almost anything else, is the sentence that triggers the old fear, because saying it doesn't just commit them to you. In their nervous system, it commits them to losing themselves. So they stay in the comfortable middle, not because they're being cruel, not because they're stringing you along on purpose most of the time, because the middle feels survivable, and the next step forward feels, on some old, half-buried level, like walking off a cliff. You can usually recognize this middle zone by its texture if you pay attention. It has warmth in it, real warmth, not fake affection. Good conversation, real chemistry, sometimes even talk of the future in vague, safe terms. Someday we should travel together. You'd love my hometown, phrases that sound like commitment but never actually resolve into a plan with a date attached. It's a relationship built almost entirely out of present tense. Everything is happening now, warmly, comfortably, and almost nothing is being built toward later. This is exactly what happened with Claire. 11 months of present tense, wonderful weekends, real closeness, real vulnerability even, in small doses, but every time the conversation drifted toward the future, toward moving in, toward meeting his parents, toward any word that sounded like permanence, the subject would shift, gently, smoothly, almost too smoothly to notice in the moment. Only in hindsight could she see the pattern. 11 months of a beautifully decorated room with no door leading anywhere else. Here's where most people make their first major mistake, and I want you to pay very close attention to this part, because it's the difference between wasting a year of your life and getting a clear answer in 3 months. The mistake is waiting. Waiting to see what happens, waiting for them to bring it up first, waiting 7 months telling yourself that's just how long it takes with this attachment style, without ever actually testing whether this specific relationship is moving toward commitment or just comfortably stalling forever in the situationship. Waiting doesn't get you information. It just gets you more time invested in not knowing. And time, real time, the actual hours and years of your one life, is the single most valuable non-renewable resource you have. You cannot get it back. You cannot refund it. Every month you spend in ambiguity is a month you didn't spend building a real future with someone who is ready to build one with you, whether that ends up being this person or someone else entirely. So instead of waiting, here's what actually works. And this is the part almost nobody teaches correctly, because they either tell you to give an ultimatum, which backfires with dismissive avoidance almost every time, or they tell you to just be patient and let it unfold naturally, which leaves you stuck in the situationship indefinitely. Neither of those is the answer. The answer is early, calm, non-threatening information gathering, not an ultimatum, not a demand, a simple, clear signal about your own standards, delivered without panic, without anger, and without begging. Here's what that actually sounds like, roughly around the 2 to 3 month mark, once you've spent enough time together to know this is worth having the conversation about. You might say something like this: I've really enjoyed getting to know you these past few months. I can see something real forming here, and I want to be honest. My time matters to me, and I want to invest it somewhere that has a real future. I'm not asking you to commit today, but I do want to know we're on a similar page about where this could go, because if we're not, that's important for me to know too. Notice everything that sentence does not contain. No accusation, no pressure, no countdown clock or threat. It's simply a clear, grounded statement of your own value and your own timeline, delivered like a fact about you, not a demand about them. And here's why that specific approach works so much better than almost anything else you could say. And this connects directly to the open loop I planted earlier. So stay with me, because we're about to close that loop completely. Remember the real question running underneath every dismissive avoidance hesitation. Does loving this person cost me myself? Pressure, ultimatums, panic, clinginess, all of those confirm the fear. They make commitment feel exactly like what the old wound predicted it would feel like. An erosion of freedom, an obligation, a trap closing shut. The more pressure you apply, the more that old alarm screams that you were right to be afraid of this all along. But calm, self-respecting clarity does something completely different. It doesn't confirm the fear, it contradicts it. Because a person who values their own time, who isn't desperate, who isn't going to quietly disappear into someone else's ambivalence, isn't a threat to their identity. In fact, watching someone hold their own boundaries with calm confidence is one of the only things that can begin to convince a dismissive avoidance nervous system that this particular relationship might be different, that this specific person isn't going to swallow them whole. This is the one behavior that actually moves the needle, not time itself, not waiting patiently for months on end. It's watching you value yourself enough that staying in an undefined, comfortable middle isn't actually comfortable for you either. That single shift, more than any speech, any ultimatum, any amount of patience, is what tends to compress that long, foggy timeline into something real. This is exactly the difference between Claire and Maya, and now you can see it clearly. Claire spent 11 months making the comfortable middle even more comfortable, more accommodating, quieter about her own needs, easier and easier to keep around without ever having to make a real decision. She never once forced Ryan's nervous system to confront the actual question. She just kept absorbing the ambiguity so he never had to. Maya did the opposite, without even necessarily meaning to send a message. At 3 months, she said her version of that calm, clear sentence, and then, crucially, she kept living her life exactly as fully as before. Same friends, same hobbies, same standards. She wasn't performing availability, and she wasn't performing indifference either. She was simply, visibly, a whole person with or without him. And a whole person is much harder for a dismissive avoidance nervous system to read as a threat, because a whole person isn't asking to be completed by the relationship. They're asking whether the relationship fits into a life that already works. Let's go deeper into why this works, because there's a piece of psychology here that explains almost every confusing thing dismissive avoidants do in relationships, not just the commitment timeline. Every dismissive avoidant carries an internal, mostly unconscious model of what closeness costs. And that model got built by watching, as a child, what happened to people who needed things from others. If needing things led to disappointment, control, or loss of self, the model concludes that need itself is dangerous, not the other person, the need, which means the safest possible partner, from their nervous system's point of view, is someone who appears to need very little. This explains something that confuses almost everyone dating a dismissive avoidant. The moment you start acting needy, chasing, over-explaining, checking in constantly, asking where things stand every other week, you unintentionally trigger the exact scenario their nervous system is built to avoid. And the moment you stop, the moment you go back to living a full, engaged, self-respecting life with or without them, something shifts. Not because they're playing games, because your steadiness is quietly proving, moment by moment, that this relationship isn't going to consume them. Now here's something important I want to add, because this isn't a manipulation tactic, and if you walk away from this video thinking, I just need to act unbothered to trick them into committing, you've missed the entire point. This isn't about performing indifference while secretly panicking on the inside. Dismissive avoidants, more than almost any other attachment style, are exceptionally good at detecting incongruence, at sensing when calm behavior is covering up anxious energy underneath. You cannot fake this. The steadiness has to be real. It has to come from an actual place of valuing your own time and your own life, not from a strategy you read in a video and are now trying to execute on someone. Which brings us to the part of this most people skip entirely because it's less satisfying than a script you can copy and paste, but it's the actual foundation everything else sits on. If you find yourself constantly needing to manufacture calm, constantly having to remind yourself not to text first, not to ask questions, not to bring up the relationship, that's usually a sign that the steadiness isn't real yet. And that's not a failure, that's just information. It tells you where the actual work is, which is building a life full enough and a sense of self solid enough that waiting for someone else's readiness doesn't feel like waiting for your own life to start. Here's a small test you can run on yourself privately that tells you the truth faster than almost anything else. Imagine right now that the person you're waiting on tells you tonight that they need 6 more months before they can even think about commitment. Sit with that for a second. If that sentence makes your whole chest tighten, if your first instinct is panic, is bargaining, is wondering what you did wrong, that's a sign the relationship has quietly become the main source of stability in your life, which is exactly the dynamic that tends to push a dismissive avoidant further away, not closer. But if that same sentence, while disappointing, doesn't collapse your entire sense of self, if you can feel the disappointment and still recognize that your life, your friendships, your goals, your sense of who you are would remain intact either way, that's the internal state that tends to produce real, lasting change in these relationships. Not because you're performing it for an audience of one, because it's true. Here's a hard truth that needs to be said clearly. Some dismissive avoidance, even with all the calm, healthy communication in the world, even with a partner who models exactly the kind of steady, self-respecting presence that tends to help, will still never fully commit. Not because the other person did anything wrong, because that early wound is deep enough and unaddressed enough that no external behavior from a partner can override it. This isn't a formula that guarantees an outcome. It's a filter. It's a way to find out, faster and with far less wasted time, whether this specific person, at this specific point in their healing, is capable of walking through that fear toward you. And that distinction matters more than almost anything else in this entire video. Your job was never to fix them. It was never to love them hard enough or patiently enough that the fear magically disappeared. Healing that wound is their work, not yours, no matter how much you love them, no matter how perfect your communication is. I want to be honest about something else too, because most videos on this topic won't tell you this part. Even Maya's outcome wasn't guaranteed the moment she had that conversation. There were weeks, she's told me since, where Ryan pulled back hard, where old patterns resurfaced, where it genuinely looked like this might end the same way it ended for Claire. The difference is that Maya wasn't gambling her entire sense of self on the outcome. When he pulled back, she didn't spiral. She noticed it, she stayed honest about her own limits, and she kept living her life. That non-anxious response to his fear, repeated consistently over months, is what eventually let his nervous system settle enough to move forward. It wasn't one conversation. It was one conversation followed by dozens of small moments of proof that she meant what she said. Your job, the only job that was ever actually yours, is to know your own worth clearly enough that you're not willing to spend years in a comfortable, undefined middle, waiting to find out if someone else decides you're worth the risk. That single mindset shift changes everything about how these relationships unfold, because it takes you out of the position of waiting and puts you back in the position of choosing. So if you're in this right now, wondering whether the person you're with is going to get there eventually, here's what I want you to actually do instead of wondering. Have the calm conversation, early, honestly, without panic. Watch not what they say in that moment, because words are cheap and easy to offer under pressure, but what they do differently over the following weeks. Do they lean in? Do plans start becoming more concrete? Does the relationship start taking up more real space in their actual life? Introductions, shared time, small signs of a shared future? Or does everything stay exactly the same, just with slightly better reassurance for a week or two before sliding right back into the comfortable middle? That pattern, watched over weeks rather than judged in a single conversation, will tell you almost everything you need to know. Not because you're testing them to catch them failing, because you deserve real information about your own life, delivered honestly, so you can make a real decision about where you're investing your limited, precious, non-renewable time. Pay attention specifically to the small, unglamorous signals, because those matter more than any grand romantic gesture. Does your name start coming up in conversations with their friends and family before you're even there to hear it? Do they start using language that includes a future, not vague future, specific future, next spring, when we, our, instead of someday and we'll see? Do they bring you into the practical texture of their life, introducing you to people who matter to them, letting you see the parts of their world that aren't curated for a first few months of dating? These are the real signals. Grand declarations are cheap and easy to say in a single emotional moment. Small, repeated inclusion over time is expensive, and dismissive avoidance, when they're genuinely moving toward commitment, tend to pay that expensive price in quiet, consistent ways rather than loud, dramatic ones. Here's the final thing I want to leave you with, and I think it might be the most important sentence in this entire video. The version of you that doesn't need this relationship to survive, that has a full life with or without a formal commitment, that values their own time enough to ask clear questions and accept honest answers, is not just the version of you most likely to get a dismissive avoidant to commit. It's also the version of you least likely to need one too. That's not a contradiction. That's the whole point.